Urugayoru Gito Va Pasanti Namsha Kim Punaha Shruta, heard about, matra, merely, api, even, ya, who, strinam, of women, prasahya, by force, akarshate, attracts, muna, the minds, uru, numerous, gaya, by songs, uru, in numerous ways, Gita, sung about, Va, on the other hand, Pasyanti Nam, of those women who see him, Cha, and Kim, what, Puna, more. Translation, the Lord, whom countless songs glorify in countless ways, forcibly attracts the minds of all women who simply hear about him. What to speak then of those women who see him directly? And how could one possibly describe the great austerities that he may perform by the women who perfectly served him, the spiritual master of the universe, in pure ecstatic love? Thinking of him as their husband, they rendered such intimate services as massaging his feet. Thus observing the principles of duty enunciated in the Vedas, Lord Krishna, the goal of the saintly devotees, repeatedly demonstrated how one can achieve at home the objectives of religiosity, economic development, and regulated sense gratification. While fulfilling the highest standards of religious household life, Lord Krishna maintained more than 16,100 wives. Among these jewel-like women were 8 principal queens headed by Rukmini. I have already described them one after another, O king, along with their sons. The Supreme Lord Krishna, whose endeavor never fails, begot 10 sons and each of his many wives. Purport, the total number of Lord Krishna's sons was thus 161,080, and he also had a daughter by each wife. Among these sons, all possessing unlimited valor, 18 were Maharathas of great renown. Now hear their names from me. They were Pradumna, Aniruddha, Diptiman, Bhanu, Samba, Madhu, Brihad, Bhanu, Chitrabhanu, Vrika, Aruna, Pushkara, Vedabahu, Srutadev, Sunandana, Chitrabahu, Virupa, Kavi, and Nyagroda. In the opinion of Srila Vishnu Chakravarti, the Aniruddha mentioned here is Lord Krishna's son, not his well-known grandson through Pradumna. O best of kings, of these sons begotten by Lord Krishna, the enemy of Madhu, the most prominent was Rukmini's son Pradumna. He was just like his father. The great warrior Pradumna married Rukmi's daughter Rukmavati, who gave birth to Aniruddha. He was as strong as 10,000 elephants. Rukmi's daughter's son, Aniruddha, married Rukmi's son's daughter, Rochana. From her was born Vajra, who would remain among the few survivors of the Yadu's battle with clubs. From Vajra came Pratibahu, whose son was Subahu. Subahu's son was Santasena, from whom Satasena was born. No one born in this family was poor in wealth or progeny, short-lived, weak, or neglectful of Brahminical culture. The Yadu dynasty produced innumerable great men of famous deeds. Even in tens of thousands of years, O king, one could never count them all. I have heard from authoritative sources that the Yadu family employed 38,800,000 teachers just to educate their children. Who can count all the great Yadavas when among them King Ugrasena alone was accompanied by an entourage of 30 trillion attendants? Purport. Sri Vishnu Chakravarti explains why specifically 30 trillion rather than an indefinite number of tens of trillions, as stated here to be the number of King Ugrasena's attendants. He does so by citing the interpretational rule of Kampinjal Adhikarana, the logic of referring to pigeons. Somewhere in the Vedas is found the injunction that one should sacrifice some pigeons. This plural number should be taken to mean not an indiscriminate number of pigeons, but precisely 3 of them, since the Vedas never leave any matter vague. The rules of Vimamsa interpretation take 3 as the default number when no specific number is given. The savage descendants of Diti, who had been killed in past ages in battles between the demigods and demons, took birth among human beings and arrogantly harassed the general populace. To subdue these demons, Lord Hari told the demigods to descend into the dynasty of Yadu. They comprised 101 clans, O king. Because Lord Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Yadavas accepted him as their ultimate authority, and among them, all those who were his intimate associates especially flourished. The Vrishnis were so absorbed in Krishna consciousness that they forgot their own bodies while sleeping, sitting, walking, conversing, playing, bathing, and so on. Oh, it's a long one. Okay, so here we have a whole series of verses describing the family of Krishna. He had married 16,108 queens, and then he had sons and he had grandsons. He had some daughters as well. And of course, as well as him, there were the whole family of the Vrishnis or the Yadus there. And as is mentioned here, there were 33 billion attendants upon Ugrasena himself. So, in other words, we'll find unimaginable numbers of people within Dwarka. That's within the material world. Or to speak of the spiritual world, which we can say has even less limitation than what we find in the material world. So, therefore, the number of associates of the Lord is inconceivable. And though we may ask how it is possible that there could be so many people in Dwarka, this is because we have limited minds, and by our logic we conclude certain things about space and time, etc. So therefore, for us, the Dwarka looks like a small place, or Vrindavan also a small place. Yet, within those small areas we have huge numbers of people living. And how is it possible? So this is because we are looking at the Dhamma within the material world from a material point of view, and we limit it. But actually the Dhamma is part of the spiritual world. It's not part of the material world. So within that Dhamma we have the Supreme Lord, and therefore he can manifest as many people as he wants within that Dhamma, and there's no overcrowding or overpopulation at all. From our point of view, of course, it looks impossible because we are looking at a material dimension. What is it, 64 crores of Vrindavan, or how many crores for Dwarka? So that's a limited number of area, limited area. Within that, you can only fit so many people. So that's material. But actually, the Dhamma, whether it's Dwarka or Vrindavan, is non-material. So it doesn't have a size as we know it. Now we say the 64 crores by convention, but actually the spiritual world and the Goloka or Vrindavan has no dimension at all. It's according to the Lord's will. They can expand or contract or whatever according to the will of the Lord. And of course, it's not subject to our concept of space and time at all. So nothing is impossible for the Supreme Lord. Obviously, the bodies are also spiritual. So do spiritual bodies occupy material space? No, they don't. So you could actually fit the whole of Goloka within a little space like this if you wanted to, because this space is nothing, it's material. And all the people themselves are non-material with non-material bodies, so there's no way of measuring them at all. So, therefore, when we hear these great numbers of people living in Dwarka, we should not be surprised, and we should not try to analyze it with the material mind, because this is simply the limitation of our material intelligence. Rather, when we hear about these numbers and the sizes and etc., then we should understand how the Lord has infinite number of powers by which he can expand everything in such a way to display his pastimes, everything to produce these pastimes with his devotees. And it doesn't matter, space and time don't matter for that. So therefore, he can manifest countless living entities or personalities within Dwarka for his pastimes. And it's not problematic at all. It's described that in the spiritual world, people do have forms or bodies, but those bodies are not dependent on food or drink or time. They don't age. Nothing happens to them in terms of material dependence. So not only that, but because they are spiritual bodies, they are not limited by size, etc. So they have a quality called satya sankalpa, by which whatever desire they have manifests itself. And if they want to change their form, they can change their form also. They can become smaller than the smallest or bigger than the biggest or whatever. Usually, of course, they don't do this because they don't like to display powers in front of Krishna. But under certain circumstances, for pastimes with the Lord, this may happen. So we see even the jivas in the spiritual world have unimaginable powers. And they also expand throughout all the different universes. So we can never count how many expansions of pastimes we have going on even now within different universes. And in each of those universes, we have all the associates of the Lord also expanded. Plus, they're also in the spiritual world. So even the jivas have expanded unlimitedly along with the Supreme Lord in these different universes in order to perform pastimes with the Lord. So to speak of the Lord, the jivas also have remarkable powers in relation to the Lord. So this is we could say, a benediction of the Supreme Lord. Even though the jiva is small, we say anu. and the Lord is vibhu, very big, all-pervading, and quite different. When the jiva becomes perfect, then he develops qualities like the Lord. And thus, the Lord bestows upon that jiva all sorts of powers and qualities that normally would not expect in jivas. So that is why the jiva has this power of satya sankalpa, by which he can manifest anything he wants. Now there's a limit, of course, so we define that jivas have a certain number of powers. The Lord has more powers, like 50 qualities for jivas, in special cases 55 perhaps. And then after that we get Vishnu, who has more powers. He has extraordinary powers that the jivas don't have. So he creates universes and avatars, etc. So the jiva doesn't do that. Nevertheless, the jiva does have a lot of similar qualities and powers as the Supreme Lord by the Lord's mercy. And therefore he's able to interact with the Lord as an equal. We see in Vrindavan, people, especially the friends, they treat Krishna as an equal. How is that possible? It's because they have very similar qualities. And it's because of this similarity that they get to attain the Lord. If they're very different from the Lord, how can they attain him? How can they even see him if they're very different? How can they appreciate him if they're different? So because of great similarity, therefore, they appreciate the Supreme Lord and establish particular relationships of love with him. That's all based on similarity. So, by the mercy of the Lord, even though the jiva is very, very small, by the process of bhakti and the mercy of the Lord, then he attains all sorts of wonderful qualities and he becomes like the Lord. And in that situation, then he attains the Lord and performs pastimes with the Lord in the spiritual world. So this is the nature of the jiva himself. So they have all sorts of unexpected powers. So all of this is beyond material conception, and in the material world it's hard for us to imagine how the Lord can have such powers and how the jivas could also have such powers. But if we have faith in the words of Scripture, if we have devotion, then we suspend our material logic in favor of understanding the inconceivable powers of the Supreme Lord and even the great powers of the jivas in the spiritual world. And in this way, all these things become very, very possible. In fact, we say common, they become common. So in the scriptures, of course, it's described that material world is ekapad vibhuti, 1/4 of the existence, and then the 3/4 existence is spiritual world. So this is accepted in the, comes from the Upanishads, but also we see it mentioned even in the Bhagavatam. But then we will use our material logic to conclude that therefore the spiritual world is 3 times the size of the material world. That's, if it's 1/4 and 3/4, then that's the material thing. If we have a pie and you cut it into 4 parts, 1 part is 3 times that is the rest of the pie. That's material logic. But that does not apply in the spiritual world at all. So 3/4 and 1/4 is from a material point of view, but actually spiritual world is unlimited. Material world is definitely limited, but even for us it looks unlimited. But actually the material world cannot compare at all with the spiritual world. So one place Prabhupada says it's like a small little cloud in the vast sky, insignificant little cloud. So it's not, 3 to 1, that's not the proportions actually. material world is insignificant in comparison with the spiritual world. And of course, size, again, as I said, is a material thing, a material concept we have. So therefore, scriptures sometimes speak using analogies so that we can make sense of something. So in this way we understand spiritual world is bigger than material world, 3 times the amount. But that's, again, material concept, a material dimension. So if the spiritual world is beyond measure, how can we even describe it? And then the material world has a certain size, and the spiritual world has no size. How do we compare the two at all? It's impossible. So just to make some comparisons, say 3 is 3 times spiritual, 3 times that of the material world, but ultimately very, very different. So therefore, we understand the inconceivable nature of the spiritual realm, and we're in the material world, but if we do sadhana bhakti and we have faith and we have some devotion, then we accept these descriptions and we can appreciate them. And then finally, when we get advanced, we realize them. So we understand the nature of spiritual space, whatever that is, in comparison to material space. Material size and spiritual size, material time and spiritual time. We can begin to understand that as we advance in devotional service. So at the beginning stages may be difficult, but we should at least understand this idea that the concept that it's through realization that we can understand the spiritual world, which is actually beyond material conception. So that is also, we can say, a test of our faith. Faith is a qualification for bhakti. And one aspect of faith is faith in the statements of Scripture. So if we can accept the statements, then that is a good qualification for advancing. Which means that, in one sense, we suspend our material judgment, our material logic, when we come to Scripture. So it's not what we call blind faith, because it is believing in Scriptures, the Bhakti Scriptures. And if we accept them, then we can advance. So the question will arise, well, why we should develop faith at all in these things? So this is a matter of good fortune only. Not all people develop that faith, and they will reject the Scriptures. They don't have faith in them, so they'll say it's all imagination. So it is because of mercy over many lifetimes that we develop that faith. And once we get the faith, then we accept. And we have no difficulty accommodating all the seeming contradictory descriptions that we find in the Bhagavatam, including even the 5th canto descriptions of the universe that look contradictory to our material logic. Right? So we can accept them because it is part of Scripture, and we've accepted the Scripture as our authority.
Maharaj just mentioned, faith means generally faith in the Scripture, if I understood properly. If you take the example of this Brahmana and the cobbler seem to have developed such a unflinching faith in the Lord, whereas not the Brahmana. The story of a cobbler, Maharaj, the cobbler seemed to have had such a faith. Maharaj mentioned the faith is basically coming from the Scripture.
Yeah.
But here we see an example of a cobbler and a Brahmana. Supposedly Brahmana is more scripturally acquainted, whereas not the cobbler. But he had such an amazing faith. How did he develop that faith?
Well, we can say that his faith ultimately was faith in the statements of the Supreme Lord or the devotees of the Lord. And the Brahmana has nominal faith But we can say ultimately he didn't have faith also. So he has nominal faith, but yes, we believe in scriptures, but ultimately, he doesn't really. Whereas the cobbler had appreciation of the inconceivable nature of the Lord and his devotees, so therefore he'd accept the statements. So we can say he had real faith, and that comes from good fortune and his mercy of devotees in previous lifetimes. The other type of faith we can say is traditional faith, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have faith in the highest principles. So we have some understanding of Scripture, but we may not understand the ultimate goal of the Scriptures at the same time.
So how does one develop that intense faith, Maharaj? As a sadhaka, how does one develop that intense faith in the Lord?
Well, we have, our qualification is faith. So it's not developed through bhakti, it is there before bhakti in one sense, in order to practice bhakti. Because if we come without faith, then we won't accept the conclusions of Scripture. We will challenge them. So we have to accept in the beginning. Now that faith deepens. How does it deepen? It deepens by more thorough knowledge of Scripture. So we have the Kanishta, the Madhyama, and the Uttama. So the Uttama is described as the person who has a very firm faith or deep faith based upon thorough knowledge of Scripture and logical ability to understand and explain them. So that gives rise to deep faith. So therefore the proper knowledge of Scripture, deep knowledge of Scripture, gives rise to deeper faith.
The Vrajavasis have no knowledge of the Scripture.
Well, in one sense they have the highest knowledge of the Scripture, because they accept Krishna and prema. So that's the conclusion of the Scripture, the final conclusion. So therefore they have the highest knowledge.
When you mentioned about the dimension, size, which is all material, we also given an example of 1/10,000th tip of the hair is the size of a living entity. But when it comes to the spiritual world, is there any understanding how to understand the size of a living entity in the spiritual world?
Yeah, well, technically we cannot measure the size of a jiva, because it's not a material dimension anyway. But we do understand, and we compare it to the Lord, and we say that the Lord is Vibhu and the jiva is Anu, so we give a size. But of course, obviously, that's a very general size. We don't say that Lord is, we can't describe the Lord because he's all-pervading, so he's everywhere. So he has no size at all. We can't measure something that is everywhere, isn't it? It's beyond your whatever measurement you have, it's beyond that. Everywhere in the material world, everything in the spiritual world, the Lord is there, so you can't really measure. The jiva, on the other hand, is a limited anu, a small particle, but just how big in terms of material dimensions we can't even say. Because all dimensions we have are material, but the jiva is not material, so it's really impossible to give him a material dimension.
Maharaj also mentioned about the dham. Even in the material world, the dham is absolutely spiritual, Maharaj. Is it right? When the dham is here in the material world also, it's spiritual. The dham in the material is also spiritual.
Yeah.
But not necessarily the living entities in the dham are spiritual, because they may not be purely Krishna conscious. We see that.
Well, we have the material aspects of the dham. This is the superficial covering of the dham. We have dirt and trees and plants that live and die, and animals that live and die, and human beings living and dying in the dham. So that's obviously not the spiritual dham. So the actual dhamma is, we can say, hidden from the material eye completely, and you see it with your spiritual eye. It's there, but it's spiritual.
So the pure devotees can see the dham even in the material world.
Yeah.
That's okay.
And if we have material eyes, we'll see a material place.
Maharaj, this 10 offenses to the dham, we know that Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur was the first one who gave them. Are they mentioned in scriptures, or did he adapt them from the 10 offenses to the name?
I haven't seen them in the scriptures. Whether he did them or somebody else put them there, I don't know.
It's in the Navadip Dham book, description there, but where they came from, I don't know the history of that. It can be researched and you can see how far back it goes, but maybe once somebody, the Gaudiya Math put them there, I don't know where it came from. I don't see Bhakti Vinod mention them as such anywhere, so I don't know where they came from.
ग्रंथराज श्री श्रीमद् भागवतम की